Good morning, everyone. I see some folks are getting on. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. I'm going to give folks a chance to just get logged on and settled, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Looks like most folks are on. I'm going to give about one more minute, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Just 1 minute. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. As we get started, just point out a few things. If you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the question box. As a test to see if it's working and everything's working okay, if you want to just put in the question box real quick and let me know you can hear me and that everything's coming through okay, you can see the screen. So make sure that's all working. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay, awesome, there we go. Just wanted to make sure. All right, so let's get moving. So typically we keep these to about 45, 50 minutes. This is a dense topic with a lot of information, so I apologize if we kind of go a little quickly. I want to try to make sure there's room for questions at the end. If you do have questions as we go, feel free to stick them in the question box and we can answer as we go. So my name is Jack Kavanaugh. I'm the Director of Training and Program Development for Mentor New York. I've worked at mentoring and youth development programs in various capacities for the past 15 years or so. My background is in social work, and I've spent the last a little over 2 years now with Mentor New York. We have offices in New York City, Long Island, and our Western New York office in Buffalo. I am based out of that office in Buffalo, but we do serve programs really across the state. So let's start with just a couple quick polls. First, just how's everyone feeling today? Give it another couple seconds to get everyone voted. All right, so pretty even split. Although no one's at the never been better, but that's okay. That's Wednesday for you. All right, one more, just so I can get a sense of how comfortable are folks with this topic. All right. So pretty mixed, pretty broad mix. That's good. So we'll be able to start from the beginning a little bit. It's good to know. Okay, so let's get into some of the content. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to talk about 4 specific things. One, a bit of background on the opioid epidemic in America. Second, we're going to talk a bit about addiction and how addiction functions. Third, we're going to talk about trauma and how it impacts young people. And finally, we're going to talk a bit about developmental and trauma-informed mentoring. If you've been on our webinars where we've talked a bit about addressing young people with trauma through mentoring, some of this might be, there's some overlap with that, but there's a lot more, not so much overlap that, you should turn off for that part, but you'll have some good base of information. So first, let's start with the opioid epidemic and substance use in America and talk a bit about stigma. One of the things that we know about the history of addiction, especially in drug use in America, has been a lot in terms of the juxtaposition between our legal and illegal drugs and how we treat them. So only, according to some research, only about 17.7% of Americans will not use alcohol in their lifetime. However, there was a time when alcohol was prohibited, and it was thought to be a source of trouble that destroyed family. So those who fought to end the prohibition focused on the financial gain to be had by legalizing it, and the fact that, quote, foreign vessels would make that money instead if alcohol wasn't legalized. This is the situation is, what we saw with their prohibition of alcohol is a very clear, I think, correlation to what we're dealing with marijuana right now. After spending decades incarcerating folks for selling marijuana, predominantly Black and brown folks, legalization is happening, and the financial gain to be had from the sale of marijuana is being shifted to different hands. Also pictured here is a scene from the 60s during which illicit drugs were promoted and publicly used. Many of the, these primary participants in these sort of hippie era were young children of wealthy white families. And you can see the juxtaposition between the way that a lot of young white marijuana users during that time were different than those who were Black. And, we don't think of the 60s and high levels of marijuana usage in the same way that we talk about, say, the crack epidemic or the current opioid epidemic. And so all that to say is that there's a lot of different drugs and lots of different substances that folks use out in the world. And there's a cultural expectation, cultural background, and cultural context to how we talk about them differently based on who is using them and what sort of community they come from. So for here, pictures on the left highlight the America's response to the crack and heroin epidemic of the 80s, as compared to the pictures on the right, which highlight America's response to the opioid epidemic. If you look at the graph in the middle, you can see the strong stance of the criminalization of drug use, particularly starting in the 80s. The Reagan administration really took the war on drugs to the next level. Nixon started it in the 70s, but obviously you can see in the graph with the Reagan administration really just took it to that next level. So each of these historical examples and historical experiences have come to layer that stigma associated with drug use, in which some drugs are acceptable to use while others aren't. And often that level of acceptability depends on race and socioeconomic status of the user. So we can observe the drastic difference in acceptance towards alcohol, for example, versus intravenously used drugs as an example. And so stigma ultimately results in social rejection, labeling, stereotyping, and discrimination. All realities that impact both the youth we mentor and their families. And as you can see, we talk about stigma, some of these terms on the right are those things that we say and talk about in a way that really highlights a lot of this. We talk about using language like addict or pillhead or, crackhead. Compare that with the amount of ads. I don't know, I was watching football this past weekend and the amount of beer ads that we see on a given day. So where does stigma and bias come from? So this is the cycle of socialization. I'm going to come back to this in 1 second. There we go. So we talk about the cycle of socialization, where stigma comes from. And so we're born into this world. And so you can see in the left here, that blue circle, we're born into the world with these mechanics in place, right? There's no blame, there's no guilt. We're not conscious of these things. And we have no choice. We have small amounts of information about a topic. So in this case, addiction and substance use and misuse. And we're just sort of, thrown into this world and taught these things. And so as we kind of move through the world, we're taught on that personal level, right? By parents, relatives, teachers, people we love and trust, who shape our experiences, the norms, the values, and the rules of how we exist in the world. As we watch other people and adults we respect and care about, and who care for us and we look up to, navigate the world, we start to see that as being the normal way to navigate the world. And that's how we learn values and how we learn expectations and the norms. And so as we start to kind of grow up through that, we can see how those things become institutionalized and cultural. So you start getting those messages from at school, on television or social media or in the news, at churches, the legal system, the mental health system, that are designed and built on certain assumptions about addiction and drug use, medical system, and then different cultural practices too. So like the music, movies, the books we read, the language we use, and a lot of this happens both on conscious and unconscious levels. And so through all of that, we really start to have these notions and these preconceived notions and these assumptions that we were taught when we were younger start really getting enforced and start really getting really cemented into the way that we start to view the world, right? And especially as we grow into professionals, or as young people start growing into the world and leaving their exact, their families or their neighborhoods and stepping out into the larger world, some of these things start feeling starting to clash with the experiences they get afterwards. And so where you see with this sort of the two arrows, is that when it kind of comes into this choice, right? That we have to kind of reinforce that status quo and do nothing and just, embrace these stigmas and biases that we've learned and been taught, or we can start to question them, right? We can start to reframe, we can stand up and, help make changes around these issues. And so this is the way that, we talk about the biases and stigmas around addiction and folks who use drugs. I mean, this is really how they come to be. This is how we get there. So how do we start to liberate ourselves from stigma and bias? So this is an example of what's called the cycle of liberation. And so there's 3 stages to this, 3 steps. First, some sort of wake up, right? Critical incident that creates this cognitive dissonance. For something, it's coming to a training or a webinar like this. For some people, it's having a loved one who is struggling with addiction. I think for myself personally, one of the big shifts that happened to me was I lost a close friend of mine to opioid addiction, and it really changed the way that I thought about it. And so you start to really question the assumptions that you've had around who these people are, what types of things are going on in the world, who uses what. And you start tapping into, our own resources to be able to empower ourselves, have introspective moments of analysis, educate ourselves, start building with community. So we start finding other people that have those sort of moments, and people who are working with young people, people who are doing the same work that we are. We're able to connect with them and build some of that community and build power, and then organize that, be that role model, be that ally, and start influencing policy, creating change. And so, for us as, folks who work in youth development or mentoring, thinking about the ways that our programs are based in assumptions around who uses drugs or who uses what drugs, or, that there are certain places and certain types of substances that are more acceptable than others, and thinking more critically about, what is it that we can do to disrupt these systems. So a really basic example of that is just the language we use, right? So there was a study by the Recovery Research Institute. Participants were asked how they felt about two people, quote, actively using drugs and alcohol. One person refers to as a substance abuser, the other person is having a substance use disorder, but no further information was given about these hypotheticals. And so after that, they found that the person who was the substance abuser was less likely to benefit from treatment, more likely to benefit from punishment, more likely to be socially threatening, more likely to be blamed for their substance-related difficulties, and less likely that their problem was the result of an innate dysfunction, and lastly, that they were more able to control their substance use without help. So some other language that you can see on the left here is words that we don't typically suggest that folks use, and on the right you can see some different examples of language that might be a bit more positive. So for example, instead of saying an addict, you'd say a person with substance use disorder or a person with alcohol use disorder. Instead of saying clean and dirty, you might say abstinent or not actively using or not an active addiction. And in dirty, you might say someone who is actively using or an active addiction. And so those simple language changes could really shift and start chipping away at some of those stigmas and biases that we talked about earlier. So how do we apply this framework, this liberation framework, to our work with young people and their families impacted by opioids? And so the bias we discussed least is the bias many of us has towards adults. We want to all do what we can for youth while leaving their parents to fend for themselves. What internal truths lead us to have minimal empathy towards adults? I don't know. I think that a lot of times as youth workers, we tend to see parents and adults as obstacles to be overcome rather than parts of the same team that we're on. And I think that it's a very common thing that I've heard and seen myself fall into a few times as well. So we're going to talk about that, really here as well, because we want to make sure we're not just focusing on the young person, but also how we can support and understand the impact that these issues are having on the adults in their lives as well. A single-minded focus on like one drug, one group of people, or one geographic location obscures the sort of multi-drug, multi-race, multi-geographic nature of the crisis that we've been dealing with right now. Folks who use opioids are also dealing with lots of other addictions, are also dealing with trauma in different parts of their lives, and is creating impact on young people who are changing their own views of drug use and addiction. And so really cultural sensitivity around this is being aware that cultural differences and similarities between people exist without assigning them a value. Positive or negative, better or worse, right or wrong. And so we're going to really make sure that we're kind of checking in with ourselves and our own biases around drug use, addiction, who uses what the nature of these types of issues are as we continue having this conversation. So let's talk a bit about substance use and its impact. So here was an example of a study. So it's 2018, Monitoring the Future studies. This was youth lifetime use. So in 8th grade, 10th grade, 12th grade, whether or not they'd use these drugs at any point throughout their life. And so youth drug of choice differs from adults, and so they're using at a much lower rate than adults. However, with vaping being an area of increasing concern. Likelihood that they will use increases throughout high school, and youth are misusing prescription drugs at far lower rates than adults. Prescription drug misuse is most common around ages 18 to 25. And so you can see here how the lifetime usage starts to increase with age, as well as what the sort of drugs of choice of young people seems to be as well, compared to thinking about ourselves, right? So why do people use drugs? I'm thinking about our own selves. So why do we use any kind of mood altering substances? I mean, coffee, cigarettes, alcohol, any of these types of things, nicotine, caffeine. I mean, these are mood altering substances. And so, thinking about what are those reasons why, I'm having a long day at work and I'm like, I really need to have a beer after work today, or I need some wine tonight. I quit smoking a few years ago, but what was kind of behind that, and that stress and that anxiety, and how I use that to self-manage. My own anxiety, mostly in grad school. Things like that. Like I need my coffee in the morning. it's a rough day if I don't get at least like a cup or two as soon as I wake up. And so, thinking about what do we do? What are we doing? Are we, wake up and get going with caffeine? Are we using alcohol to celebrate, to de-stress after work, or, take the edge off and manage anxiety through nicotine? All of these are, example of how we view some of these legal addictive substances as both acceptable and different than using other substances. And so thinking about the way that we use legal frameworks of what's legal and not legal as moral frameworks of what's morally right and what's morally wrong, when those are sometimes two very different things. So typically why people use illicit drugs: to feel good, to explore new things, to do better, and to feel better. So, if they want to feel better at a party, or they're, relaxing, explore, so curiosity and boredom, an escape from kind of the routine of life, to do better, so be more popular, peer pressure, increased acceptance, and then to feel better, so, managing depression, anxiety, loss, to, relax and manage anxiety, self-medicating because of their mistrust of medical professionals, or they don't have insurance. And these are all very real reasons why people, engage in different, using different substances. And it's important that use doesn't always equal addiction. As we begin to further explore drug use, it's really critical to understand that using a drug does not mean that use is problematic or that it is an addiction. This is especially important to consider when we are mentoring young people that are experimenting with drug use. Experimentation is a normal part of adolescence, and while we know that risk for addiction increases once you try a drug, we must be balanced in our response so we're not overreacting to their choice to experiment. This will be discussed further when we talk about the mentoring portion at the end. We talk about trauma-informed and developmental mentoring. But so you see, stage one is experimenting with the drug, often out of curiosity. Stage two, the use of alcohol, social use. So that's notable would be like a happy hour, right? So, you're going out to work after, going to a bar after work for a happy hour. That would be social use of alcohol. Stage three is when we go beyond social use and start seeing signs that the use of a substance is negatively impacting our daily functioning. And stage four is that full-blown addiction, which is marked by an inability to control use, regardless of negative consequences. And that's really the hallmark of, when we think things cross into addiction, that inability to manage use, even though there are major negative life consequences, financially or relationships, things like that. So some signs and symptoms of use. I'm not really going to read all of these, but some physical and behavioral things to kind of be aware of. Decline in physical abilities, weight fluctuations, so either drastic increase or decrease. Cold sweats, tremors. Behavioral things, so increased aggression and irritability, depression and anxiety, change in friends and isolation from family and friends, involved in criminal activity, financial issues, borrowing money often, that can be a big sign as well. So these are just things to kind of keep in mind as we're thinking about, what does this look like in young people? And the reality is that different substances cause different effects on folks, short and long term. So some different responses that have solutions that have popped up. So we've seen different things in the legal system, so things like drug courts. I know here in Western New York, a lot of different municipalities have their own drug courts. So if you are at, if someone is arrested and involved in the legal system because of drug use, they might get moved to a drug court where they're able to avoid, incarceration or, financial penalties if they seek treatment. There's lots of different treatment options, so inpatient and outpatient. Inpatient would be the detox or kind of rehab facilities, outpatient counseling. Typically, if someone is struggling with addiction, they'll start with the kind of least restrictive option first. So someone will go to outpatient counseling for a certain amount of time, and if that doesn't work, they might move into inpatient if they relapse a number of times. Some of that relapsing that relapsing can be part of the process and it happens, but it's like we just assign that someone needs a higher level of treatment. It's important to remember too that when it comes to inpatient treatment, there's very limited spaces. So for example, in Western New York, where I am, there are two detox facilities that I know of in like the entire Buffalo area, like this 7 or 8 counties right around here. And one of them is pretty much exclusively for alcohol addiction, because alcohol, detoxing off of alcohol can be lethal. People can die from that. But there's just a major shortage of beds and opportunities for folks. There's also medication-assisted treatment. So the most kind of commonly known of this is methadone. They started really using a lot more methadone as an intervention. I think it's gone out of favor, and now they will use drugs like Suboxone or Vivitrol. Suboxone typically for opioids, Vivitrol typically for alcohol. And so they function in different ways, but there are opportunities for folks to replace the use of whatever illegal drug with a doctor monitored substitute. And so that's kind of what we talk about harm reduction. And so harm reduction is the idea that, if people are going to use substances, they're going to use substances. What we can do is try to minimize the amount of harm that comes from that. And so medication-assisted treatment is probably the most common harm reduction strategy, but there's a number of other ones that have been growing in popularity. It's somewhat controversial, but the research seems to indicate that they're very effective. There's also 12-step and other mutual aid groups, Alcoholics Anonymous and AA or NA being a really common one that most folks know. There are other ones. So for example, Smart Recovery is another one that folks do that's non-religious. There are some that are very more explicitly Christian, Alcoholics Victorious, things like that. And so there's lots of other ways of doing that kind of peer support instead of just seeing mental health professionals or addiction professionals. Having a co-occurring disorder often complicates a lot of this, and this is something really important to talk about, especially with adults. And so co-occurring disorder is when someone is diagnosed with both a mental illness, as well as a substance use disorder. And so making sure that we kind of, we don't have to get too in the weeds with this, but it's just important to know that that is very common, that most people who are diagnosed with a substance use disorder and seek treatment are diagnosed with some type of co-occurring disorder, whether it's depression, anxiety, PTSD, anything like that. So let's talk a bit about trauma, and then we'll get into our last section, which is the, this is great, but, how does this help me? How do I, actually change how I work with young people? So SAMHSA, which is the Federal Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, defines trauma as individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Trauma is, how do we know when it's trauma? So trauma is determined by the person who's having that experience. So you and I can have the same experience, and I can internalize and process it as trauma, and you don't. That doesn't mean that the person for whom it isn't a trauma doesn't see it as a negative experience. It just means that they're able to process and work through it in a manner that does not have lasting adverse effects. And part of what we'll talk about in the mentoring piece is, how do we help young people not process things as traumas, that not, process all negative experiences as traumas. Part of what makes trauma so hard to understand is it's sort of a hidden wound. We don't see it like we would a physical wound, it's just a cut. And it's important to remember that while we can't see the wound, trauma has an impact on the brain. And so you can see that here. I don't really love the language here of a healthy and abused brain, but I think the picture is very useful. This is someone from a young person who was a orphan in Romania, who was institutionalized shortly after birth. And so you can see the effects of that deprivation in infancy. And so where the temporal lobes are, for those who don't know, is really a part of us that regulates emotions and receive input from the senses. And they're nearly just completely underdeveloped. And so this is from just really childhood neglect, an underdeveloped brain, which then results in a child who grows up with poor ability to regulate emotions and high level of functioning. And so thinking about how we kind of recognize trauma, and again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's lots of different things. But I think the reality is, as we talked about in the substance abuse portion, engaging in risky behavior such as substance abuse is a common coping mechanism for trauma survivors. And so we want to keep that in mind as we're considering youth's risk for substance abuse and the parents of the youth impacted by the opioid epidemic, right? So these are all different signs and symptoms of coping mechanisms of trauma, but I just want to highlight specifically engaging in risky behavior, for example, AOD, which is short for alcohol and other drugs use. And sometimes, they can almost see these positive symptoms in which trauma survivors become high performers, classroom helpers, and other behaviors in an effort to earn love, affection, and attention, or to, prove their worth as a result of their trauma. And so sometimes we tend to overlook these youth, and we shouldn't assume that young people who are not acting out have not or are not experiencing trauma. It's also impossible that there are no noticeable signs. And so this is where it's really important for us as mentoring youth development professionals to build those strong relationships and to set that table so that we can start to see some of these signs and coping mechanisms for what they are. Because when you have that deeper relationship, you can start to peel away those layers and see, what's happening underneath. And again, if you have specific questions, feel free to put them in the question box. That's what it's there for. So let's talk about the adverse childhood experiences study. So this was a study that they did in the early 90s. And so it was one of the largest studies and investigations of child abuse and neglect and later life health. So what they did was an HMO, was Kaiser Permanente. They took 17,000 of the HMO members who were coming in for their annual physicals, and they had them complete a survey where they marked down how many of these adverse childhood experiences they dealt with or had experienced. And they started to map that with people's adult health outcomes, so physical health, so illness, things like that. And so the 9 ACEs or adverse childhood experiences were physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, and household dysfunction, which included mental illness in the household, an incarcerated relative, mother treated violently, substance abuse in the household, or divorce. And so they had a number of, I think, 3 major outcomes. One, that these ACEs were just a lot more common and more frequently used, frequently experienced than they had anticipated. Most of the HMO members that they were polling were, upper middle class white families. When in the 90s, that was just not who would be assumed to be dealing with these issues. And so they were really surprised by that, both just how common, higher ACE scores were. 2, that they tended to cluster. And so you would hardly see an ACE score, which is what they call, however many ACEs you experience as a young person, as a child. They tend to cluster. So you'd see someone might have like 1 or 2, or they have like 6 or 7. We wouldn't really see someone with like 2 or 3, right? And it kind of makes sense if you think about it, right? Again, we know that mental illness and substance abuse tend to come in pairs. If you have someone who's, dealing with mental illness and substance abuse, there's a chance that they might end up incarcerated at some point. And if someone's incarcerated at some point, and that can really correlate with some, physical and emotional neglect, right? Or there might be abuse at home, or all of these things, they start to scaffold on top of each other, and trauma starts to snowball. The other thing to remember when we think about trauma is that it's sometimes easy to think about young people or anyone dealing with trauma as a specific wound, right? Like someone gets like a stab wound would be the physical counterpart. So we think about it in terms of like a car crash or a sexual assault or a violent assault or there's some specific incident that happens. When sometimes what we know about trauma is that the way it really looks like is more like being in like a room that's slowly filling with water and you just don't know when it's going to fill all the way. And that experience is more like, not knowing where your next meal is going to come from or where you're going to be able to sleep that night or being scared to go home and dealing with the stress of that because, as soon as you get home, you're going to have to be dealing with, violence and abuse or, things like that. And so it's sometimes it's not one like sharp event, but it's that constant stream of stress and anxiety that starts to have an impact on our brains. And so the last one was that higher ACE scores tend to correlate with serious later in life health outcomes. So you can kind of see them, here's a really basic graph. So as more ACEs that someone had on the y-axis, you can see risk for negative health and well-being outcomes increases. So that includes health outcomes like obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, behaviors like smoking, alcoholism, and drug use, and then life potential, graduation rates are lower, academic achievement, lost time from work. And it starts to scaffold, right? If you think about those adverse childhood experiences, so people are dealing with these traumas as young children, that's going to lead to that disrupted neurodevelopment, right? Remember that young person who was in an orphanage in Romania and was deeply neglected. That neurodevelopment starts to decay. Then you have social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. The brain is not fully focused and fully formed when they're a child. Then when they start getting through school or young adulthood, their social, emotional, and cognitive skills start to, be impaired. And so that can lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors, right? Because that's how we cope, that's how we deal with things. So, that's smoking, alcohol and drug use, risky sexual behavior, things like that, which can then lead to disease, disability, and social problems. So those start to, those behaviors start to trickle into our, onto our lives, and then that leads to early death. One of the other ways it starts to function too, remember we talked about trauma as being that like constant high level of stress, is you have a brain that's constantly being flooded with stress hormones like cortisol, right? And so you have these hormones that are just, a brain that's constantly in a state of fight or flight of anxiety. And the lasting effects of that as well can have very serious physical impact on someone as an adult because, the brain is not designed to be constantly flooded with those hormones. And so we can think about how these types of things impact parenting, right? So if someone's trauma as a young person affects them as an adult, that's going to affect their ability to be a parent. So they might become neglectful, overly permissive, enmeshment issues, right? Treating a child as their best friend or like a mate, failure to provide structure, high stress or substance use during pregnancy, excessive punishment and discipline, and inability to provide basic needs. And so all of these family risk factors are risk factors for young people themselves to then engage in substance abuse and other risky behaviors. So it becomes a cycle. It becomes something that just, starts perpetuating on itself. And so that's exactly why we have to support families and not just youth. So if we're thinking about, again, impacting and mentoring young people impacted by opioids and other addictions, then we have to think about that young person in the situation of their entire family. And those parents, those adults, those are humans who deserve our empathy. And sometimes we have struggled with empathy for them because of their substance abuse. And we might see the misuse as a choice, which, again, really means we don't really understand what's going on with addiction. Because we know more about addiction, we know that it's definitely not a choice. And so regardless of any of their parents' shortcomings, most young people's love for them is unwavering. And so our impact on youth through mentoring will always be limited by their family and community realities, which are reflected in family and community risk factors. And so if we're mentoring and providing these supports, and if we're one seeing their parents as just obstacles to success, or we're not supporting their family, and saying like, not supporting their family, start saying to these young people that, who cares about your mom, let's focus on you. But for them, their relationship with their mom is everything. I've worked with lots of young people whose parents have been struggling with addiction, and it's really hard on them to kind of go back and forth. But it's always a common thing about wanting to go back. So we'll talk briefly about the trauma of being a child of an adult struggling with AOD misuse. So again, alcohol and other drugs. So it's important to remember, again, having a parent or caregiver struggling with drug use is a trauma, right? That was on the list of those adverse childhood experiences we talked about. And so we want to frame, we are mentoring trauma survivors, and many have several traumas. And so it's important to focus on supporting them as trauma survivors rather than kids who we need to prevent from using drugs. Drug use likelihood is minimized when the support and care they receive is maximized. So if we know that trauma, that high ACE scores, things like that are what leads to young people using drugs down the road, then our work as mentors doesn't necessarily have to be focused on just drug prevention. It's about easing their trauma and making them feel supported, because we know that has a lasting impact on young people's choices. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but again, we talked about some of these mental health issues that could pop up among young people and adult trauma survivors, right? So again, if we think about them as trauma survivors, we're going to start recognizing these issues in them: depression, anxiety, PTSD, ADHD, and ADD. And I'll be sending all the slides out as well to you, so you'll be able to reference this later. And then trauma treatment. So therapy, individual, group, and family. There's lots of different modalities that people use to address young people with trauma. EMDR is a really common one for people with really serious PTSD. So eye movement, desensitization, and I just forgot what the R stands for. But it's really interesting, very effective treatment that involves actually like closing your eyes and moving your eyes in different directions to kind of force your brain to reprocess your traumas. Cognitive behavioral therapy is another one, working on coping skills and education. Sometimes using a school counselor or support groups at school. These are usually briefer and less function. They're not going to diagnose and do these really deep therapies, but they can do kind of some of the high level supports and then refer out. And the support groups can often be age specific or trauma specific. And trauma treatment often doesn't begin immediately following what happens, right? A lot of times it's sought out due to symptoms becoming unbearable or coping skills being insufficient, experiencing negative impact on daily functioning, or they're forced through a court order after negative coping mechanisms resolve legal issues, right? Assault, stealing, truancy, things like that. So let's just kind of check in and move it onto the last section. So we talked about some of the substance and trauma to build a foundation. Effective mentoring of youth impacted by opioids requires us to leverage the knowledge we gain to guide our approaches. And so this final section pulls from knowledge gained in previous modules. This is actually, I should say, this is really a 3 to 6 hour in-person training that I kind of shortened into this. So that's when we say different like modules and things like that. So 3 keys to effective mentoring. 1, being developmental and not prescriptive. 2, trauma-informed and culturally sensitive. And 3, always know where you are on the relationship development journey. We're going to talk through the 3 of these. Research has been consistent in confirming that mentors and caring adults can positively impact youth life in several ways. Just being there as a support is helpful, but we increase our effectiveness as a mentor by ensuring we are developmental, trauma-informed, and culturally sensitive in our approach, as well as thoughtful about where we are in the journey when deciding what we will do or say. And so again, let's go through this and see what it looks like. So first, being developmental. So the difference between developmental and prescriptive mentors is focusing more on how do we develop them and their own skills and their own coping and protective factors versus just telling them what they need to do and making it about our skills and our wisdom. So, for example, developmental mentors will listen more than they talk, where prescriptive mentors might give advice more than they listen. Development mentors might play games, just hang out, or help with homework, depending on what the mentee asks for that day. Prescriptive mentors might focus on hard tasks to meet specific goals based on what the mentor thinks the mentee needs. And the biggest one, developmental mentors are help to build the mentee's own confidence to solve problems and be successful, as opposed to prescriptive mentors who might try to fix the mentee and the mentee's problems. And so as a developmental mentor, it's important to be there for them and to support them in developing the needed skills, and again, not there to fix them. It facilitates opportunities for them to identify and express what they want to achieve and how they define success rather than choosing those goals for them. And so asking questions as much as possible. Even when you want to teach them something, we can do it by asking questions. And remember that sometimes we have to take a step back from learning and just enjoy time and be present with them. Be trauma-informed and culturally humble. So cultural humility, again, is that awareness that cultural differences and similarities between people exist without assigning them a value, positive or negative, better or worse, right or wrong, and that learning about them is an ongoing process that never ends. Sometimes folks will talk about, cultural competence as though there's an end point, at which point I'm competent, right? But I think thinking about it as it's an ongoing process, and all of these different things that impact a young person, their race, education, sexuality, gender, and age, different levels of ability, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, all of these pieces, are going to impact their experience. And we want to make sure that we're, using a trauma-informed lens. And so these are the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. First is, thinking about it, the framework is being what's wrong with you, in changing that language and to start saying what happened to you, right? What is it in your history that has, happened to you that has led you to this place at this point? And so the first R is realizing. So realizing the widespread impact of trauma and understand potential paths for recovery. And so that's what we're doing right now. We're talking about the widespread impact of trauma. We know that it's out there. Recognize those signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff. And that's that, taking it from that place of just knowing that it's out there, that it exists, to figuring out, okay, how do I recognize it when it's right in front of me? I'm sitting with my mentee and we're talking about something that they're struggling with, and I kind of clicks for me is like, oh, this is because of, that other thing they dealt with before. They're feeling particularly sensitive about the school year ending, just moving to high school, and they have some issues with abandonment because of, their mother being incarcerated when they were 3. This is probably where that's coming from. And then we can kind of respond by, really thinking about the knowledge that we know about how to address and work with young people impacted by trauma, which we're talking about right now, into the way we do it both interpersonally and into our policies, procedures, and practices. And then lastly is resisting. So resist that re-traumatization of children as well as the adults who care for them. So avoid that traumatization, I think, is one of the more nebulous points, but things like being consistent and showing up, facilitate predictability. During the experience of trauma, the survivor did or did not have control, and this can result in struggles with sudden changes in environments and activities, as well as unpredictable experiences. We can offer choices. So again, that lack of control and lack of choice about what happened, what environment they're in, and many others can create a sense of powerlessness. So we want to push back against that. And obviously we want to be judgmental. We don't want to judge their experience or their response to it. There's lots of stigmas and shame around trauma and what might have happened with them, whether even that's just as simple as not having enough food at home. They might be embarrassed or ashamed of what they're dealing with, and we don't want to add on to that by really being shocked and judgmental about how their parents could let them not have food at home. We just want to listen and have conversations about it. So we want to be mindful of responses, including those facial expressions, which might convey shock and other emotions about them, what happened to them and who did it, which can appear judgmental. And so we don't want to project our own thoughts and emotions about their experience onto them. And then third, remember where you are on the mentoring journey. So there's 4 stages to that mentoring journey. First, the beginning and building phase, the honeymoon phase. So getting to know each other, bonding and building trust. Stage 2, testing and challenging. So testing that relationship and your commitment. This is when some of those first impressions might be challenged, difficult feelings and emotions might surface. Stage 3 is that real mentoring, right? This is when we're really getting to work with each other, right? Trust is established. You start seeing growth in the mentee, that really deep bond. And then finally, closure or transition. When that relationship starts shifting into something else. And that might mean closure, that might mean some other type of renegotiation, or it might mean committing to deeper mentoring for life. And it's no different than any other relationship. Structured mentoring relationships is manufactured and produced rather than connecting through the natural relationship development process, which really further solidifies the point of the relationship needing time to develop. And so it's just like any other relationship in that it needs that time to develop. Timing matters when making decisions about what you do and say in the mentoring relationship. It's important to be patient because these changes take time and outcomes increase over time. And so the longer we're in relationship is, making sure we're able to do that more, the longer we are with them. So even in therapy with like licensed professional clinician, it typically takes about 16 sessions or 4 months to see a reduction of symptoms and 6 months to a year to see a discontinuation of behaviors. Self-esteem takes even longer to improve with an average of only 50% improvement by session 48, which is a year. And most mentors, and that's with trained professionals, which most mentors are not. So the developmental relationships framework is a really good tool for starting to utilize some of this stuff. So they looked at what adults can provide young people to help them develop into who they are. And so it starts with adults who express care, challenge growth, adults who provide support, adults who share power, and adults who expand possibilities. So all of these things are things that we as adults want to make sure we're providing. And again, you'll be able to get all this in the slides when I send it out. And then thinking about how do those turn and shift with where we are in the relationship journey, right? So in that beginning and building stage, we're going to focus mostly on expressing care and sharing power, right? We're going to be dependable. We're going to listen. We're going to respect and include them. We're going to start learning how to be warm and encouraging, and then we're going to move into that testing and challenging. We're going to starting to provide support, right? We're going to help them navigate and advocate. We're going to empower them to achieve certain things. We're going to start, letting them lead more and collaborate on what we're going to do. And then once you get into that real mentoring space, you can start thinking about how do I challenge growth? How do I expand possibilities? And including that into the transition and closure stage. And so just a few final things, then we'll move into the last question and answer section. But don't be afraid to admit ignorance or confusion. Don't discourage alternative views or perspectives, and don't use scare tactics and coercion in response to their behavior, regardless of the level of risk involved. Instead, we want to seek to understand them by asking clarifying questions. We don't want to project our beliefs on them. We want to be aware of unaddressed historical trauma that we may have that's influencing how we are approaching and responding to the youth. We don't want to make assumptions about their perspective, experiences, and knowledge. We want to be prepared for a variety of responses and viewpoints that they may have regarding a parent or caregiver who uses. We want to help them learn to identify and communicate their feelings and emotions so that they are empowered to communicate more often and more effectively. You can use things like a feeling chart to facilitate this if there's not something they're super experienced doing. As they expand their ability to identify feelings, you can incorporate this into conversations with them. For those who struggle to directly share their feelings or concerns, we can get creative. We use a song, color, or drawing to express themselves. When I used to work with high school students, we would just draw and color together all the time. I think especially for a lot of older kids, it's like a nice little return to, being younger and a sort of sense of innocence that can really help them express things really um, in a much more direct manner. When serious topics are expected, try to avoid direct eye contact to minimize their discomfort. So you can talk while driving, doing art like coloring, shooting basketball. I use that a lot, or another activity. Be like, oh, let's, just shoot some layups on the basketball court outside while we talk. And it's a good way to kind of distract and get them more comfortable opening up. And we can also introduce activities that support mindfulness and self-regulation. So it's crafts, coloring, drawing, painting, sculpture, pottery, ceramics, writing, dance and movement, drumming. And art really helps with that self-regulation and is a very healthy coping skill. So you can start putting some questions in the question box if you have them. I'm going to go over just a few things. So some additional services that we offer as an organization, you can reach out. The last slide has my email, and I'm going to get there in a second. We offer individualized training and technical assistance for individual programs. We also offer services like the Mentor Connector, which helps programs recruit mentors and mentees, the National Quality Mentoring System, which helps us assess programs adherence to best practices, and lots of other additional webinars that I'm going to send you links to. And the last thing I'll ask, if you have just a few minutes, if you take your phone out and point your camera at the little QR code on the screen, a little link to SurveyMonkey should pop up at the top, and it'll give you just a brief 5-minute survey just about the webinar and how we did. And I would really appreciate that. And lastly, here is my email. I'm going to leave the question box open. If anyone has any specific questions, now is the time. All right, well, I don't see any specific questions in the question box, so we'll go ahead and close up. If you do have anything that comes up for you or anything you want to know, and so we'll send all the slides out as well to you, so you'll have all of that, access to all the information there. If you do have specific questions for your program, other than that, just feel free to reach out, shoot me an email at any time, and we can kind of connect. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a great rest of your week, especially those who, said that they would love to fast forward to tomorrow. I hope you have a great week, and thanks for coming, everyone.